The mixer is the brain of your sound reinforcement system. A wide variety of sound sources are sent into a mixer: vocal mics, instruments, mic'd amplifiers, CD player. And the mixer will then process and balance all of them into one unified sound or mix for your audience to listen to. It's a complicated procedure, and you certainly don't become a skilled front-of-house engineer overnight. Having said that, understanding a mixer is not actually as forbidding as at first glance it might seem. Why? Because although it seems as if you have to learn an entire panel's worth of knobs and faders, a mixer is mostly made up from what are called channel strips, all of which have identical controls. So, learn the controls on one channel strip and you've learned them all. There's more to a mixer than channel strips, of course, but that's a great start to this particular voyage of discovery. A mixer has more things connected to it than any other device in the sound system. Signals coming in are referred to as inputs, signals coming out, outputs. This is a standalone mixer, which you connect to an amplifier and loudspeakers. Some mixers also include amplification, and these are called powered mixers. These are covered later in this scene. On standalone mixers, the inputs are normally situated here, at the rear, though sometimes you'll come across a mixer with inputs right at the back of the main panel. This is where you plug in the cables from your instruments and microphones, and each of these connects to an individual channel on your mixer, so that you can make individual adjustments to that sound. You'll notice that each channel has two input connectors. One, a multi-pin balance connection called an XLR, which is mainly for microphones, and the other a 1/4-inch jack connector marked line, which essentially you use for most everything else. Mixers are used to process sound, and sometimes this involves the use of special audio effects. Although some mixers may come with an effects processor built in, you may also want to use a dedicated effects processor. And these are also plugged in at the back. There are two methods of connecting effects units to a mixer. The first is into an individual channel via a two-way connection called an insert point. This you would use for a device that's designed to be used just on one sound or one channel at a time, like a compressor or limiter. The second is into a circuit called an auxiliary bus, which then lets any channel make use of the effect. You'd use this method for something like a digital reverb unit. An auxiliary bus is simply a special piece of wiring in a mixer that can be tapped into by other channels or controls, rather like, well, stops on a bus route. So we have a number of sound sources and effects processors coming into the mixer. How does the sound leave? All mixers will have at least one set of outputs that carry the unified or mixed signals out to your main amplification system. Usually, they'll have a second set of outputs that can send a different balance or mix to an amplification system designed for the musicians or performers on stage to hear, so that they can monitor or listen to themselves and each other. This is called a monitor system, and that mix will come out of its own set of outputs at the back. Completing our front panel overview, the other knobs and faders, aside from those that run along the channel strip, relate to effects and monitoring and the group functions. This area of the mixer is referred to as the master section, as it has all of the output controls. We've identified something called a channel strip, but what does it actually do? A channel strip is simply a row or strip of controls that all relate to a single input channel. A quick glance at a channel strip will tell you an awful lot about a mixer: what sort of EQ or tone control it offers, how much flexibility there is in terms of monitoring and patching in effects. At the top is one of the most crucial areas of the mixer: the input. This is important both in terms of the quality of the actual components and the care that you take in terms of setting the input level. This is the point at which your sound source enters the mixer, and the strength of this signal is governed by the gain control, sometimes referred to as a trim pot. This regulates the strength of input signal. On some mixers you may also find a pad switch for instant attenuation. Sometimes you might even find a pad switch and a trim pot. Learning to set these controls properly is really important. If a sound gets off on the wrong foot, so to speak, it's almost impossible to correct the problem later on. Whoever coined the phrase, "fix it in the mix," certainly didn't mix live sound. First, you need to make sure that the sound source is coming into the mixer at a level that'll give you as much clean, i.e. undistorted, signal as possible. Ideally, you want to end up with all your sound sources at the same strength of signal. You'll need to make adjustments at this stage because different devices output sound at different levels. Microphones, for instance, output low-level signals and so need greater initial amplification here. Electronic keyboards, effects units or CD players produce more initial signal, so they don't require as much amplification. The reason setting input gain is so important is that if you don't get enough signal into the mixer, the signal won't be strong enough and attempts to increase the output volume will add noise and hiss. Bad news, to be sure. But worse, if you have too much signal coming in, your sound is going to be distorted. If a sound is distorted at the input stage, you'll never be able to undistort it. It's like trying to carry an overflowing bucket of water. It'll never work. You need to take some water out, then you can carry it. These initial decisions are crucial to what is referred to as your gain structure, basically keeping your mixer and mix as free from either distortion or extraneous noise as possible. Good gain structure is essential if you want your mix to sound clean and punchy.
By far, you have to have proper gain structure. Without proper gain structure, you're 10 steps behind.
Okay, to set the input gain properly, position your channel fader at 0 dB or unity gain, and then ask the performer to send the strongest or loudest signal he or she is likely to play or sing. Make your adjustments so that the meter or peak LED for that channel just nudges into the red. If your input signal barely registers, then you need to increase the gain. If the signal is too hot or loud, like this, you need to turn it down. Following good gain structure practices at each stage that sound passes through your mixer is half the battle when it comes to getting a good mix. Armed with this array of knobs, you may be tempted to now start fiddling around, adjusting tone controls, adding effects and so on. But in fact, the sound system actually consists of more than just electronic gear. Professional audio engineers know that a good sound starts at the source. In fact, most of these folks live by the rule, he who uses EQ and effects the least, uses them best. So, if the singer sounds like he's got bronchitis or the snare drum sounds feeble, the first thing you need to do is to make sure that the microphone is positioned as it should be in order to capture the sound properly. Then you might want to try swapping the mic, or suggest tactfully that the drummer may want to tune his snare or even replace one of the heads. The point is, the better the original sound, the better your final mix will turn out because you're not having to compensate for weaknesses that you have little control over. You're simply making the performances louder. Sometimes tonal adjustment is necessary, and that's where these next controls come into play. EQ is short for equalization, and all mixers offer some form of control, be it a simple high, mid or low, boost or cut like the tone controls on a basic home stereo, or a sophisticated system where particular frequencies in a sound can be isolated and adjusted. We'll look at the whole subject of EQ in greater detail in another scene. For now though, here are 3 handy tips to keep in mind about EQ. 1. Use it sparingly. Too much EQ will almost invariably make a sound unnatural. 2. Cutting or reducing the level of certain frequencies can be just as powerful as boosting frequencies when it comes to improving a sound or curing a problem. 3. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. If a sound doesn't need any tonal adjustment, don't make any. And to help solve some specific problems, here is a simple switch that automatically filters out low rumble type noise. It's called a high-pass filter. This switch comes in handy if you want to reduce wind noise from microphones when working outside. It could also protect your loudspeakers from damage if someone accidentally dropped a microphone. Mixers are riddled with abbreviated names for odd-sounding features. And here's another one, AUX. The prime duty of a mixer is to combine multiple sound sources into one unified signal going out into the main speakers. That's not all they do though. Most mixers provide AUXes, or auxiliary signal buses, that tackle additional requirements such as being able to add effects to a particular sound and being able to deliver a mix for monitors on stage. Both such capabilities are handled by auxiliary buses and controls, normally referred to by their abbreviated name of AUX. When you see an AUX rotary control on a channel strip, it's really just another level control, adjusting the amount of signal from that channel to that particular AUX bus. AUX buses come in two varieties, namely pre-fader or post-fader. Sometimes they can be switched, as indeed they can here. If the AUX bus is pre-fader, this means that your sound is being sent to the AUX buses before it comes under the control of its main channel fade. Pre meaning previous or before. What does that mean though? Well, it means that adjusting the main channel fader will not disturb the amount of signal going to the AUX bus. And that's important because you don't want, say, a monitor mix to change just because a particular sound has been increased or decreased in the main mix. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? So why on earth would we need a post-fader setting then? Think about effects. Say you set up a nice effect on a voice, some slapback echo or reverb. Now, if you want to adjust the overall level of that vocal, you'll also want to adjust what gets sent to the effects device. So if this AUX is post-fader, post meaning after the fader, then the two will always go hand in hand, just as you wanted. Moving down, pan is another abbreviated term, short for panorama. Just as it sounds, the pan control can send a particular input to the far left, far right, or dead center. While we're on the subject of panning, it's best not to pan signals full left or full right. In a live sound setting, very few people in the audience will be hearing both left and right speakers equally. And if you completely pan something all the way to the right, people on the left-hand side of the audience probably won't be able to hear it at all. While most switches and controls actively process or affect sounds, others are there just to help you keep track of things. And this can be very important when you have the pressure of a live show to deal with. This switch, for instance, gives you a helpful visual indication of which channels are on and are being sent into the main stereo outputs. This small switch, marked PFL, which stands for pre-fader listen, allows you to instantly hear the sound of that particular channel in your headphones, no matter whether the channel fader is up or down. And this can be a great help to check and confirm signals without disturbing your main mix. PFL is also extremely helpful when setting your initial input levels, because you can do this A, without the sound coming out of the mains, and B, because you can make use of the main level meters for additional visual help. Finally is the fader or slider that increases or decreases the channel output. Some mixers may use a knob for this, but the function is the same. We've covered a lot of ground here, so let's recap. At the top of the channel strip are the input controls where you set the level of signal coming into the particular channel. This is followed by EQ controls that govern tone. Then come the aux send levels, sending varying amounts of your channel to the monitor mix or to a connected effects processor. And finally come the pan control, channel on switch and main channel fader. Encouragingly then, you can see that we've covered more than 3/4 of the controls in this mixer. Enough theory for the moment. Let's take one or two individual instruments and see what happens in practice.
The first thing I like to start with is the bass. The bass player here has a nice amp that has a balanced line out feature that makes it really easy to get a good bass sound in the mixer. I just need to take a long XLR cable from the amp and plug it into one of our mixer channels. Then I ask the bass player to play about as loud as he thinks he's going to play. I turn on the pre-fader listen and then adjust the trim pot so that I get a good hot signal that just peaks in the red, but doesn't really distort. This bass player uses a lot of finger technique as well as slap and pop styles, so I've inserted a compressor in the channel just to smooth the dynamics out a little bit. The bass sound already has enough bass on it, so I don't really need to do any boosting there, but I like to add a bit of mid-range growl to the bass. Depending on how much slapping or popping he's doing or playing with his fingers, sometimes I'll add just a little extra high end just to help cut through the mix. Once I have a sound that I'm happy with, I turn off my PFL and I bring up the channel fader and see how it sounds in the main speakers. Because the bass player already has an amp on stage, there's no real reason to add any bass into the monitor mix. There's already plenty of volume from his amp for the rest of the band to hear. As for the snare drum, we're going to position the mic down towards the head of the snare. Our drummer's already tightened up the head, and we've got a good initial sound. Once we've gotten the mic positioned, it's pretty much the same process like I did with the bass player. I get the drummer to play just about as loud as he's going to play on the snare drum, and I bring up the trim control, adjusting the volume till I get a good signal but not too hot. I like a nice punchy sound to my snare, so one thing I'm going to do is add a little EQ. There's not a lot of bass already on the snare, so I don't have to do anything there, but I'm going to add a little high end to give a good snap, and a little mid-range like I did with the bass to give it some growl. Once I get a sound I'm happy with, I'll turn off my PFL, bring up the channel volume, and have a listen to how it sounds through the main speakers.
No matter what your sound source, this is a very typical way that you would use the controls in a channel strip. There's more information on handling different instruments, mics and singers in the soundcheck scene, and more on the use of EQ and effects in the individual EQ and effects scenes. The whole point of a mixer is to produce a good mix. And a good mix is just that. A good blend of sounds that feels unified and controlled, allowing the audience to enjoy your performance as a whole, not just the performance of a tambourine or the bass guitar. Achieving this involves many things, from the quality of the sound and musicianship coming off stage, to the miking, EQ, to how various instruments are adjusted as the performances take place. As with EQ, less is very often more. If you see an engineer playing with faders like they're some sort of arcade game during the show, you can be pretty certain that there's either something drastically wrong going on, or that they're just a complete novice. One of the ways to minimise obtrusive changes to the levels of individual sounds is to group like-minded sounds or parts together. If, for instance, the drums in general are a bit quiet, you can then gently raise the level of every drum channel using just a single fader. And that's what this fader does here, marked Group 1-2. On the MG16-4, you place a channel onto a group bus simply by pressing the 1-2 button. You can monitor on headphones what is being sent to the group bus by switching between the group and stereo, i.e. the main stereo outputs, using this switch. And obviously, just because you want to be able to control a group of like-minded instruments as a group, you still want them to go out of the main stereo mix as well. Well, actually there are times when you want a group submix, as it's often referred to be separately controllable. If, for instance, you want to send a group mix out to a recording device. This switch allows you to send the group submix to the main stereo bus, or not. The MG16-4 has groups 1 and 2, and just a single fader marked Group 1-2. What's the point of having two group channels if you only have one fader, you might ask? As is often the case, the channel's pan control can affect a signal not just left and right, but also to buses 1 and 2. Although you have just a single fader in this instance, there are two independent group output jacks, so you could say, send all the vocals out of Group 1 and all the drums out of Group 2, just by assigning the channels accordingly using the pan control. Using groups buys you flexibility. We discovered that the aux buses can be used for patching in effects processors or to set up a separate monitor mix. How does this relate to the aux send and return knobs here in the master section of the mixer? As you recall, aux 1 on this mixer can be set to either pre or post fade. In the pre-fade position, aux 1 would be used to feed a monitor mix. Here's how you set it up. On each channel you control the level going into the monitor mix using the aux 1 control on its strip. Need more guitar in the monitors? OK, raise the level of the guitar channel's aux 1 knob. Meanwhile, on the master side, the aux 1 send control governs the overall level of the entire monitor mix going out to your monitor amp and speakers. The aux return control actually operates just like any other input channel, and in fact can be a very useful additional input sometimes, say for a click track or a sequencer signal, and this controls the level of anything currently patched into your mixer via the aux return. Aux 2 here is set to post fade, so this is a bus you'd normally use for the external effects processor. Again, the aux 2 send control governs the strength of signal going into the effects processor, and aux 2 return the strength of affected signal coming back to be added into the main mix. Finally, this knob here marked ST governs the level of aux 1 and 2 that you want going into the main stereo mix, i.e. your out-front sound. If you have, say, an external reverb unit patched into aux 2, the beauty of this system is that you can send varying amounts of each input to the reverb via the aux 2 knob on the respective channel. So you can add just a touch of reverb, say, onto the snare drum, and relatively plaster your lead vocal in reverb. Not saying you necessarily want to do this, you understand, but you get the general idea. We cover setting up and using external effects processors in detail in its own effects scene. Now you have all of your channels set up and balanced the way you want, the monitors and the effects set up as you like. All that's left to do is adjusting this guy, the main fader, to raise and lower the level of your entire mix as the crowd gets more and more rowdy, or just goes home. In this scene we've concentrated on the basics of mixing. There's of course a lot more to learn in terms of mixing as an art, and mixing in a variety of settings from a house of worship to a club to a concert. And you can pick up some great tips on mixing by viewing some of the practical application scenes as well. A powered mixer is, as its name suggests, a mixer with a built-in power amplifier. Aside from this obvious blending of features, powered mixers often go on to offer graphic EQ and even digital effects processing under a single roadworthy roof, as you can see here on the Yamaha EMX68S. Understandably, there's a trade-off between all-in-one labour-saving designs and specific component designs that focus on one thing at a time, but these mixers can still be powerful as well as powered. They're designed to make setup and teardown as quick and easy as possible. Connect your loudspeakers at the back here, plug in your mics and instruments, and your system is basically ready for work.
Because it has reduced the number of pieces that we need. Instead of having a separate dedicated mixer, a separate dedicated EQ, and then an additional power amp, I now have an all-in-one package which can make most of these things work. Less connections to make, less setup time, far simpler for the operators.
So let's see how the EMX presents its mixer controls in so small amount of space. Inputs. Due to its physical design, inputs are placed at the bottom rather than the top. Well, you don't want a whole bunch of cords covering up the rest of the channel strip, do you? Out of this mixer's 6 input channels, 4 offer a choice of balanced XLR inputs for mics, plus a high and super high Z 1/4 inch jacks. High Z inputs are high impedance inputs that let you plug a guitar or bass straight into the mixer without having to involve a preamp. Here, as opposed to gradual control over the input gain, you simply have a pad switch that cuts the input by 30 dB if your signal is too hot. This is done to reduce setup hassles. On channels 5 and 6 here you have a simple choice of XLR for mics or 1/4 inch line level input for synths, drum machines or other line level devices. On a powered mixer, rather than give you total flexibility on all channels, the designers tend to give you purpose-built solutions. Here's how you'd set up a small band using the EMX68S. And here's how you'd set it up for something like a conference with multiple microphones and recorded music coming off a CD. Moving to the top of the channel strip, we can see that 3 bands of EQ are offered on all channels. This is a really good idea because powered mixers are probably going to be used in, well, let's say unusual spaces, not just dedicated music venues. So it's very helpful to be able to compensate for things like dead strings or maybe just dead acoustics in a totally carpeted bar or restaurant. In place of open-ended aux bus sends on a channel, like you find on a console-style mixer, here you just have a dedicated monitor control, which really is just an aux end set to pre-fader, and this lets you send the required amount of that instrument to a separate monitor mix. And an effects send level fixed as post-fader, and this lets you send the required amount of that instrument to the internal effects unit. This is both quick and simple. Moving down we see a pan control for left-right positioning, and in place of a channel fader, space kind of dictates a channel level knob. Over on the right-hand master side, the most eye-catching controls are a pair of graphic equalizers, one dedicated to the monitor mix, the other for your out-front sound. Having this sort of control can be crucial if you're working in a variety of places with strange sound characteristics. if you're surrounded by hard sound-reflecting windows, or maybe playing at an open-air wedding where the bass just kind of floats off into the ether. Since this is a powered mixer, the front panel also lets you decide how you want your available power to be distributed. Are you using monitors? If not, then you can harness all the available power for the main speakers. Do you need to bridge that system even for more power out of a single mono speaker? Or do you need to connect more speakers or indeed another power amp? Yamaha's powered mixers offer internal effects processing, and here we see a dozen or more classic effects from reverbs to echo effects, chorus, even distortion, offered in no-nonsense preset form. And if you do want to plumb in your own favourite piece of outboard gear, you can still do that using these master aux sends and returns. For small club work, especially if you're primarily using a sound reinforcement system to amplify vocals and support just one or two additional instruments like acoustic guitar or flute or upright bass, and especially if you need to run sound and play, having so much control at your fingertips is not only good, it's pretty much essential. At the end of the day, literally, you want to be able to power down, unplug your mics and speakers, and have the gear in the back of the van before the last night's audience has found their car keys. And with a powered mixer, you can do just that. A digital mixer is still a mixer. In other words, its basic purpose is the same as any other mixers: to coordinate many different sound sources into one unified mix. The digital part of the equation concerns how this is done, and the control options and flexibility with which it is offered. The advantages of digital equipment is that you can store and recall settings and setups at the touch of a button, plus use a computer to provide additional features such as programmability and storage. Looking first at the internal benefits of a digital mixer, although the channel strip would appear to be much like its analog cousins, there is one major enhancement here. Just because you plug into, say, channel 1 on the mixer, you can actually route that input through any channel you like. The internal routing, in other words, is totally flexible. Additionally, although you may have the same amount of EQ and effects possibilities as you do on an analog mixer, all of the settings and levels can be recalled at the touch of a button. Right, no more squinting at pieces of paper or trying to remember that great EQ setting you had on your lead singer's mic. And this goes for channel fader positions as well. Yes, very eye-catching, isn't it? Although, as you're probably starting to understand, mixing is more to do with setups and slow movements than rapid changes to your sound. There's no denying, though, the power of being able to recall these settings at the touch of a button. Here on the Yamaha 01V96, for instance, you can recall multiple scenes, complete with effect settings, and this is a wonderful facility to have, especially if you're mixing several bands in one night. But it's also extremely useful for particular effects. A different range of EQs on a ballad maybe. Finally, the power of signal controlling effects like noise gates and compressors is undeniable, but also so is the expense of purchasing several noise gates or compressors, which is what you'll need to do for every channel on an analog mixer on which you'd like to apply these effects. Not the case here. A noise gate and compressor limiter is available on every single input channel. You can imagine, and the smart ones I'm sure can work it out for themselves, the cost saving on this alone. A digital mixer is not just a sealed unit. Its very digital nature allows you to interface with computers both for storage and recall of data and for on-screen control, such as here with the 01V96's Studio Manager software that replicates and in fact expands upon the controls and functionality of the 01V itself. If you're travelling light, you could, for instance, simply carry your settings on your laptop and download them into the mixer provided by the venue anywhere in the world. Plus, there's a whole range of expansion cards that let you add new features and new functionality. Affordable digital mixers were pioneered by Yamaha, and they continue to come in all shapes, sizes and prices, right up to the PM1D that we can see installed here at the Cerritos Performing Arts Center in California. But they all have this in common. Take the fun and games you can have with any mixer, and then add the almost limitless flexibility that you can get by throwing computer control into the mix.